Liberalism, section. Oscillations and limitations of the Marxian model. Clearly distancing himself from the apologetics more dominant than ever today, Marx drew attention to the, quote, conservative character of the English Revolution. While on the one hand it marked the transition from absolute monarchy to constitutional monarchy, and promoted the development of industry and the bourgeoisie, on the other it gave impetus to a gigantic, ruthlessly implemented expropriation of peasants. Examined closely, the Glorious Revolution emerged as, quote, a parliamentary coup d'etat for the transformation of communal property into private property, end quote. We thus encounter a formula that, in a way, evokes the tangle of emancipation and disemancipation I have stressed. The mention, albeit vague, of Parliament's decisive role in this event draws attention to the disappearance of the absolute monarchy, while making clear reference to the tragedy of the peasantry. Someone who distinguished himself in the ideological limitation of the colossal expropriation and ruthless repression that struck its victims was Locke. This, quote, most particular supporter of the lash for vagrants and paupers, end quote, was, in fact, at the same time, the father of free thinking, the protagonist of the great ideological battle that deconsecrated absolute monarchy and stripped it of its Christian and biblical cover. And once again, as in the Glorious Revolution, so in the liberal philosopher in whom it found theoretical expression, the tangle of emancipation and disemancipation reveals itself. Finally, Marx recalled that corresponding to the advent of constitutional monarchy in England was a further intensification of the dictatorship exercised by English property owners over Ireland. Over and above any particular country, what should especially be borne in mind are the general considerations offered by the Holy Family. With the disappearance of the Ancien regime, corresponding to the dissolution of the political existence of property was its more potent existence, which could now unfold the full scale of its own existence. Or, as On the Jewish Question put it, quote, the shaking off of the political yoke was, at the same time, the shaking off of the bonds which had held in check the egoistic spirit of civil society. Political emancipation was at the same time the emancipation of civil society from politics, and even the appearance of a universal content. End quote. Marx brought out the entanglement of emancipation and disemancipation. The more potent existence injected into property was also the autonomization of property in human cattle from the controls, albeit vague, of the church and crown, with the consequent crystallization of racial chattel slavery. And it was also the disappearance of the restrictions placed by the crown on the expansion of the colonists, who could now proceed unhindered, without being in any way concerned with the terrible human costs inflicted on the Indians. In England, enclosure of common land was followed by the new law of 1834, which, abolishing any other form of assistance, confronted the poor with a brutal alternative: death from starvation or internment in a total institution. However, we must not lose sight of the fact that we are not dealing with an autonomization of property as such. What corresponded to the more potent existence of the colonists' property was the death agony of another form of property. It was a gigantic process of expropriation, justified and theorized by Locke and de Tocqueville alike, which unfolded at the expense not only of colonial peoples, in America or Ireland, but also of English peasants. The same reasons that led me to regard the category of proprietal individualism as inadequate and misleading now prompt me to seek to clarify Marx's analysis. The process we are examining was the autonomization of the property of those who already enjoyed recognition, of those who aspired to form themselves into the community or caste of free men. liberated from the fetters of control by crown and church, was not only bourgeois property, but also traditional noble property. In the England that emerged from the Glorious Revolution, the landed aristocracy consolidated its enjoyment of certain privileges, hunting, for example, and consecrated its political power in representative bodies, in the first instance with the House of Lords. With Marx, we can say that, quote, the political revolution is the revolution of civil society, end quote. But it should be added that civil society can be hegemonized by the bourgeoisie or the landed aristocracy, or can be characterized by a compromise between these two classes. And the liberal revolution consists in this political revolution. Up to this point, we can only subscribe to Marx's analysis and admire it for its acuteness. But he continues by opposing the political revolution to the social revolution, or political emancipation, which is the objective of the first, to social emancipation, the end of class domination, which is the objective of the second. The limitation of this conceptual couplet is that it does not take into account of the fact that for some social or ethnic groups, the liberal revolution did not involve any kind of emancipation, but in fact meant the reverse. Is it really correct to define the United States of 1844, the year On the Jewish Question was published, as, quote, the country of complete political emancipation, end quote? Certainly the reference is to the rapid disappearance of censitary discrimination, which continued to be marked in France under the July monarchy and in Britain. However, what induced this differential development in the case of the North American Republic was the availability of land, taken from the Indians, and the confinement of a large part of the dangerous classes in slavery. In other words, the property barrier proved much weaker because the race barrier was much more rigid. Differently put, the United States democracy emerged first because it emerged as a Herrenvolk democracy, as a master race democracy. And this specific form proved so tenacious that it survived the Civil War by many decades. It is highly problematic to regard Herrenvolk democracy as complete political emancipation. Even if we restrict the comparison to New World countries, some questions are indicated. Was political emancipation more advanced in the North American Republic, which saw slavery flourish in these years, and which a little earlier had extended that institution to the Texas taken from Mexico? Or was political emancipation more advanced precisely in Mexico and those Latin American countries that had abolished the institution of slavery some decades before? In these years, U.S. leaders and ideologues liked positively to contrast the ban on miscegenation imposed by them with the crossbreeding that was spreading in Latin America. Where was political emancipation more advanced? We cannot even unreservedly endorse Marx's thesis that, quote, political emancipation is certainly a big step forward, end quote. We already know that the most tragic chapter in the history of the Indians began with the American Revolution, and that the period between the Glorious Revolution and the American Revolution witnessed the emergence of a racial chattel slavery of unprecedented harshness. In the case of Britain, it was Marx himself who drew attention to the far from positive consequences of the coup d'etat of 1688-89 for the English peasants and the Irish population. Even more debatable is the subsequent identification of political revolution with bourgeois revolution. The latter category is at once too narrow and too broad. As regards the first aspect, it is difficult to subsume under the category of bourgeois revolution the Glorious Revolution and the parliamentary revolt that preceded the upheavals that began in France in 1789, not to mention the struggles against monarchical absolutism, explicitly led by the liberal nobility, which developed in Switzerland and other countries. On the other hand, the category of bourgeois revolution is too broad. It subsumes both the American Revolution that sealed the advent of a racial state, and the French Revolution and the San Domingo Revolution, which involved complete emancipation of black slaves. The model proposed here is different. It equates political revolution, qua revolution of civil society, referred to by Marx, with the liberal revolution in the strict sense. Certainly, in order to be able to promote its emancipation from absolute power, civil society had to have achieved a certain level of development. Analyzed in their initial phases, the revolutions that occurred in the Netherlands, England, America, France, and Latin America were not very different from one another. They were all liberal revolutions. What clearly differentiated them were three factors: the varying configurations of civil society, the social, political, and ideological conflicts that developed within it. One thinks in the French case of the struggle between nobility and bourgeoisie, and the eruption in the struggle of servants and slaves. With the emergence of the last factor, the struggle for the emancipation of civil society waged by the property-owning classes became entangled with the struggle waged against them by those who did not want to be regarded as objects of property, and who sought to secure recognition. The secessionist revolt of the slaveholding South also presented itself as a liberal revolution. It was a new struggle for self-government by civil society, like the one that had sanctioned the independence of the United States. Was the Confederacy a liberal country? If we regard the country born from the War of Independence against England, and long led by slave owners, as liberal, it is hard to see why such recognition should be denied to the Confederacy. Yet, rather than at a conceptual level, the solution to the problem is to be sought at a historical level. At the point when the principle of the, quote, uselessness of slavery among ourselves was imposed in the liberal world, an author like Fletcher, who also recommended slavery for white vagrants, ceased to be a liberal. Almost a century after its first turn, the liberal world underwent a second. Now, condemnation of hereditary slavery as such was dictated as a constitutive element in its identity. After the end of the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, the racial state largely survived. And once again, the question arises: was the United States, where discrimination and oppression raged against blacks and genocidal practices against Indians, a liberal country? The principle of racial equality became a constitutive element in liberal identity only from the mid-20th century onwards. The racial state continued to exist in some decades in South Africa. However, although historically inspired by Britain in the area of self-government and representative bodies, and by the southern United States in that of race relations, it was henceforth regarded as alien to the liberal world. End of section.